Our second reading for today comes from the second chapter of Kings. Second chapter of 2 Kings. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went and stood at some distance from them, as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water. The water was parted to the one side and to the other, and the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." And Elisha said, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended into a whirlwind into heaven. And Elijah kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in pieces. He picked up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. And he took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water. He said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Where is he?" He struck the water again, and the water was parted to one side and to the other, and Elijah crossed over. May God bless this reading. Well, last week I shared a little bit about my first experience of church camp. I was 21 years old, so I didn't do church camp as a kid. Instead, I got thrown in without really knowing what was going on. I was a peace intern, which meant that I visited 6 different summer camps over the course of 8 weeks and led discussion groups among young people about peace and justice issues. And it did take some getting used to. It took a lot of being uncomfortable. At this point, I had not been to any of the states that my camps were in. But then I found out that God would indeed show up, mostly in the presence of camp directors and counselors, and of course, in the campers themselves. But by the end of that summer, I more or less knew what I was doing, which I feel like is a joke that should get some laughter. If you're at camp, do you ever really know what you're doing? And indeed, that last week of camp, I got a couple of surprises. So my last week of camp as a peace intern was actually in Nova Scotia, in Canada, at Johnston Christian Camp, which is the site that disciples have up there for the disciples' churches that we have in Canada. If you didn't know, our denomination is the Christian church in the United States and Canada. We are a bi-national church. And one of the things I learned while I was at summer camp in Canada is that Canadians do things differently than we do here. For one thing, my job was to lead conversations about peace and justice. When one of the topics is the role of the military and foreign policy, that resonates with people who live in the US in a way that it doesn't with people who live in Canada. So I had to quickly pivot and change some of the things that I was talking about. But it was the final day of camp that really brought the biggest surprise, and this is a memory of camp that I have that goes on that list of infamous events in the history of camp for me. There's this thing that a lot of church camps will do. I actually don't know if they do it in Florida or not, but a lot of churches do church Olympics. Do they do that in Florida? No? I don't know. Anyways, church Olympics is exactly what it sounds like. There's a competition. They'll have field games and water games, and they'll get messy, and you're competing against one another, and you're trying to take home the gold medal. And the gold medal, when I was in Tennessee, I can remember it was the golden plunger. You know, it's fun camp things. Well, Canada had a Camp Olympics Day, and I don't even remember what the competitions were, in part because I will never forget how the whole thing started, and I think that just steals the whole show. You see, out in front of the camp, there was this circular driveway, and in the middle of it, there was a fire pit. And they had an opening ceremony. And I can still remember standing there, and the director of the camp, Jen, who I've stayed friends with, kind of whispering to me the words to the Canadian national anthem as we sang the anthem. And then I remember a pickup truck pulling around the driveway into the main area with one of the young campers in the back of the pickup truck holding a cone-shaped torch that was lit. Not kidding. It was a literal torch lighting ceremony. Now, I don't know if they still do this or not. I would recommend that you don't try this. And everything from the camper riding in the back of a pickup truck to the lit torch, maybe don't do that. But they did it. And it's this reminder of these traditions that camps have, because I imagine they lit the torch, shape them around our particular context, in our particular place and time. But we are constantly receiving and sending these traditions on to others. We're trying to allow our lives to be shaped by them, but then to help the next generation's lives be shaped by them. Like the passing of a torch. Except don't let your campers do that. Our story for today in Scripture is very much a passing of the torch moment. There's this very strong sense of something being handed off from one generation to another. The prophet Elijah is preparing for the end of his ministry. And he is traveling, and it's very clear from the passage that he knows what's coming. He knows that this is the end of what he has been working on, and perhaps even the end of his earthly life. He is traveling in a direction in which God has called him. And we know that his student, Elisha, is following him. And one of the things that happens in this story, I think it might have been before, is that Elijah keeps telling Elisha not to follow. And Elijah, being the good student, says, "No, I'm going to keep following you." And before they get to the end, Elijah, the student, asks for a gift, for a double share of his spirit. And as we anticipate this separating, we can feel the passing of the torch as Elijah gives Elisha his mantle. So explicitly, this story is about a teacher and a student, a mentor and a mentee, and their final moments as one concludes ministry and one begins. But there's an implicit pattern going on in the story too. The writer of 2 Kings utilizes what is known as a chiastic structure. So this is a story that goes through a series of steps in one direction, reaches an inflection point, and then makes the steps in reverse. And so you see that in this passage. The two approach the Jordan, this river that is very famous in the history of Israel, and Elijah rolls up his mantle and strikes the water, and it parts. The two then cross on dry land. Elijah is taken up in the chariot. And then what happens next is that almost in exactly the reverse pattern, Elisha takes the mantle and strikes the water and crosses over on dry land. It is as though the storyteller wants you to see this not just in the words, but in the actual patterns of the story itself. These ministries are similar, though different. And as one is passed on from teacher to the student, it may change a little bit, but the nature is still there in it. And these literary elements in this story, of course, reference even more depth in the tradition. You know, striking the water, if you have spent any time in Sunday school in your life at all, should sound like a familiar story. To strike the water and have it part is to bring to mind the original prophet called by God, Moses, and the parting of the Red Sea. And the Jordan River itself is always a literary element in the Bible. In the book of Joshua, when the people get to the promised land, God commands the people to bathe in the river Jordan before they enter the promised land. It is a sign of this new thing, this preparing for what is to come. So this story is thick with these references to the passing of the tradition from one to the other. But it's not just about what a student learns from a teacher, but it's about that process of transferring the tradition from one to another and then reinterpreting it for a new time and place. Because Elisha lives in the legacy of Elijah, but his ministry will take on its own character. Just as Elijah's ministry is not exactly like Moses' was. The tradition is received and then transformed and then passed on. We're always a part of the legacy, but we're always also making it our own. And we all do live this pattern to some extent or another. Sometimes we like to believe that we start from nothing. We have no inheritance. But in reality, almost everything we do is something that we have received from another. That's part of being human. Communities passing on the way we do things. We are all reinterpreting these things for our own contexts. This isn't just about religion, but about life in general. Traditions are passed on, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. Sometimes in ways that are good, and sometimes in ways that we have to be careful. I heard a metaphor a few years ago about this passing on of the tradition, particularly as it relates to faith, and both the warnings but also the potential. It comes from the Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who wrote, "Religion is like fire, and like fire, it warms, but it also burns. And we," he writes, "are the guardians of the flame." And I learned about these words, this quote about religion being a potentially good thing and a potentially dangerous thing. I learned about this while I was on a clergy trip to Northern Ireland. I went with a group of clergy from Indiana to visit Northern Ireland and to learn about the period of time known as the Troubles, which was a several decade-long conflict between Catholics and Protestants. It was a time of violence, of hatred, of really terrible things being done. Thousands of people were killed in the course of several decades. And this was fueled by religious people in Northern Ireland. It was really interesting to go learn about what reconciliation learns as people of faith when the people who caused the strife in Northern Ireland were pastors and priests. But even though the conflict was started on religious grounds, there were also places in which people of faith tried to seek healing. We stayed at a retreat center on the northern coast of Northern Ireland called Corrymeela. It's a place of deep faith. And at that retreat center, they spent decades bringing together people of faith trying to heal the divisions. They would literally have retreats in which the Orange Army, the Protestant extremists, would meet together with the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. So it was like a summer camp, except for people who hated one another, and people who probably were going to go home and cause harm to one another. And there were so many stories from that trip I heard about these people of faith who had seen the pain that their faith had caused, but were seeking to be sources of reconciliation. There were Catholic churches that secretly hosted meetings with Protestants where they had to literally sneak them in the back so that nobody would know that they were meeting, to try to heal the divisions. And that's where this quote comes from. Religion can and has burned people. We can't ignore that that's the case, but it has also had this incredible ability to provide warmth and comfort and healing. It is like a fire, as Rabbi Sacks writes. And we, as people of faith, are called to be the guardians of the flame. And for me, every time I go to camp, I experience this process, this passing on of the faith in a way in which we hope it leads to reconciliation, in which we hope that it breaks down the barriers of hate and prejudice in our world. We hope that the torch is passed from us to those who come after us in a way that changes the world. And there is always this danger when the tradition is being handed on that it may be used incorrectly. And so at camp, we seek to pass on our faith and our values and our tradition in a way in which it can be healing. Reinterpreted. Having gone to camp this year, it is not the same it was 20 years ago when I was a peace intern. But it's the same process that we see when the prophet Elijah passes on his mantle to Elisha. At camp and in church and other places, young people learn what it means to follow Jesus in their own lives. They are introduced to people at camp who are not like them, who are from different places, different areas, different walks of life. Sometimes even people who speak different languages than they do. But at camp, they seek to learn what it means to follow Jesus in their own lives. And it is always my prayer when we talk about camp in the church or youth ministry or whatever it is, that we continue to try to pass on the parts of our faith that center reconciliation and love and mercy. It's also my hope that when we pass on the faith, those places where it has grown stale, or where the ideas are no longer pertinent to living a Christ-like life in today's world, that those are allowed to fall to the wayside, that we will be okay when young people transform the faith for themselves. And I pray for all of the ways in which we are part of that process, allowing our own tradition to change as needs arise. And most of the camps that I visited, they sing the song when they end. Again, I can't remember if Florida does it, so I'm looking at my Florida campers. Do you all still finish the night with Pass It On? Sometimes? We've been singing it in worship, but I love the words when we think about what it means to be people of faith passing on our traditions. It only takes a spark to get a fire going, and soon all those around can warm up in its glowing. That's how it is with God's love. Once you've experienced it, you spread the love to everyone you want to pass it on. And that's what we seek to do. May we continue to pass on the faith to others, whether it is in what we do here at Riverside, at the retreat at Silver Springs, or anywhere else that we follow ourselves. May we be guardians of the flame, ready to pass on the light that warms and comforts